Hey, Rowdy crew, welcome to the Rowdy Podcast. I'm here with Chief Boerboom from the Minnetonka Police Department, and we just wanted to sit down and have a quick conversation. I asked you guys for some questions, and I have taken those questions, and I'm going to be asking Chief Boerboom those questions for you. So let's get started. Chief, would you introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure,
Just
thanks.
let them know a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks, Val, for meeting me last week.
Sure.
It was a good discussion we had, and I'm Scott Boerboom. I'm the Chief of Police here in Minnetonka. I've been with Minnetonka for about 23 years.
Okay.
I've held a variety of assignments. As you know, a police officer starts on the street, and then they move up through the ranks. And I've worked in the schools. I've worked traffic. I've been in the detective division. But prior to coming to Minnetonka, I was actually working with the Los Angeles Police Department for 3 years.
Oh, really?
So I have a short stint in a big city department, and then I moved back to Minnesota.
Awesome. Okay.
So that's pretty much it.
Well, I have a question for you. So I wore my my Wu-Tang socks.
Yep.
And would your officers know that I am nothing to F with?
You know, I don't know. I will say it doesn't really match your shirt.
Fair enough. That's fair enough. Okay, well, I tried. So I'm going to get right to some of the questions because I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you're very busy. So Miguel asks, I am curious to know how many hours at the police academy are towards learning and studying the Constitution.
Well, I mean, when you think about the Constitution, most of the work you do is on the First Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I will openly. First Amendment is one that's covered, but not covered as in detail as you're talking the Fourth or Fifth. So when you think about the Fourth Amendment, it's really the right to stop you in a car or to search your person. So there's a lot of emphasis put on the Fourth Amendment. Fifth Amendment, obviously you have the right not to talk, right? And so you have Miranda.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the Sixth Amendment we cover in class. I teach actually at a private college in Minnesota.
Oh, okay.
And I teach specifically constitutional law.
I did not know that. That's awesome.
You know, you didn't know that.
I like that.
My class actually starts next week.
Cool.
And so you know they touch on First Amendment, but quite honestly, when we think about the First Amendment, most of the work that we've done has been in service when you come out of school. I mean, obviously we touch on it because you have the right to protest, you have the right to be in public space, and so we're very well versed on that. And honestly, that's something we've actually gotten better at. But it's not something that's covered as in depth as you think about like the Fourth Amendment or Fifth Amendment or Sixth.
Okay.
So it is covered. And that's something, you know, when you think about the police academy, just for clear, police officers go to a community college, either a 2-year or 4-year program, and then they go to what most people refer to as a police academy.
Okay.
We call it a skills program. That is mostly your hands-on, you're shooting, you're driving, you're using the tools on your belt.
Mm-hmm.
That's mostly covered in what most people think of police academy. The First Amendment, the constitutional law, most of that stuff done is in a college setting.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So that's interesting. I didn't know that you teach constitutional.
I do.
That's so cool. That's I like that. And that also explains, so for the viewers, I know a lot of them don't know, but the reason I met you was actually I was doing an audit on the department, and I came into the city hall, and right now the police station is under kind of construction. Part of the city hall and everything is under construction right now, so
Yep.
I kind of didn't have an option to like walk around the building the way I wanted to, but nobody came up and said anything to me. Everybody just said hi, and that was kind of it. So, but then I was walking past here, and in fact, the chief said hi, and I said, "Is there anything I can help you with?" But not like what are you doing, but just more so like, "Hey, I just noticed you walking around. Do you need anything?" And so we started talking, and that's how this all came to be. But that's awesome. So Michael asks, would it be possible to evaluate officers in a manner that doesn't emphasize arrests? And his reason for that was that so many audits show police looking for a crime to charge the person they have stopped. In their encounter, they frequently have an attitude that the public is guilty and they have to prove that they're innocent. Now, I know, and I've had a lot of conversations with law enforcement, and I know there's this curiosity side that makes a good police officer, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of how they're graded, and I mean, can you first answer to how you would grade an officer? Is it about arrests? Is it about citations written? Because I know there's a lot of rumors,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
So can we kind of unpack that first and then get to the rest of the
Yeah.
question?
First of all, I think I often hear it called quota.
Mm-hmm.
We do not grade our officers. There's performance evaluations. It has nothing to do with arrest data, traffic stops, citations. We track it,
Okay.
but we don't grade our officers on that. And quite frankly, you cannot have a quota, for one, and secondly, we don't grade our officers. It's really the quality of service they provide. If I have an officer that stops one car a month and I have an officer that stops 15, it's the quality of the stop and the interaction with the person. And so everybody's a little different. Officers have, like anybody, they have pet peeves, right? You may have an officer who has who's more aggressive with speeders.
Okay.
Looking for speeders, or those that maybe be drinking and driving.
Sure.
And you have those that want to go out and maybe knock on a door and have a conversation and spend more time with somebody. They're both equally good. The question is how they're treated, how people are treated.
I would agree 100%.
And really, that's what I'm looking for when I think about grade or evaluating an officer. It's on the quality of the encounter, because I think most people would appreciate. I have officers who make traffic stops, a lot of them, and on most of them they get a thank you. That's good. They're getting, they're doing enforcement or they're doing education, but they're doing it in a way where they're respectful. And then you have those that maybe don't get that.
Yeah.
I'm more concerned about those that don't get that same reaction, because I think any reaction could be positive. Even if I'm going to give you a ticket that's going to cost $150. And so to your first point, we don't grade our officers on that.
Okay.
And I think part of your other question, cops in general are suspicious. When they see something, they're trying to figure out what's happening. And so I think that's their human nature as a police officer. And I think that's going to lead into your second part of your question.
Sure. And so I guess kind of my question is, there's and this kind of gets into like the meat and potatoes of the conversation at hand, but I'll just give you an example I think would be logical, and you kind of see them all over. But like, let's just say a cop pulls somebody over. It's nighttime, 10 o'clock on a Friday, we'll say. It's me in the car, or Jason or somebody, and they roll the window down 2 inches.
Correct.
And they hand you their driver's license, they hand you their insurance. In the state of Minnesota, we don't have registration like that. It's on the tabs, and that's all it is. But so we hand you those 2 things, and at that point, sometimes the officer will say something like, "Can you roll the window down all the way?" Some state troopers, and I know you're not a state trooper, and I know you can't speak on behalf of them, but some will say, "Hey, can you roll your other window down as well?" And that's kind of get that flow of air through the car so that you can pick up any odors.
Yep.
So if somebody says, "No, the window's okay at that 2 inches, let's, whatever you pulled me over for," what are you, and I know you can only speak for your department, but what are your officers trained to kind of do in that scenario where somebody's just protecting themselves from a scenario like that?
And I actually, honestly, I think scenarios are good, and I often use a scenario in class.
Okay.
And I'm going to probably pull some of that, because I teach a group of 35 college students, and they have the same question. And so we talk about this quite often. And I find that what I try to do is, it's good to know some people know their rights, and some people, quite frankly, don't know what they can do. Can they say no?
Very true.
Right?
Yeah.
And if they say no, what's going to happen next, right? But to your question about, and also the passenger side, oftentimes on freeways, they approach on the passenger side.
Yeah, which makes sense.
But I think the point you're making is that they're stopping me because they want to see if I'm drinking, and they want to be able to see that or smell that.
Well, it could be marijuana, it could be a lot of things.
Could be anything. And, that's not uncommon. But if you have a driver who decides not to, the officer's reaction should be to recognize that, but know that they can't do it. There's nothing more you can do. There's no requirement that you roll your window all the way down.
And by the way, just to be clear too for the viewers, we're only talking about the state of Minnesota, so every state's different. You have to research your local laws, and that's on you as a citizen to make sure you're educated. So don't take what we're saying and try to apply that to Texas or something. Just to be, this is not legal advice, okay?
Yeah, that's actually a good point, because I don't know what the laws are, but I know, and I instruct our students, the students that I have, that all you have to do is provide your driver's license and insurance. You don't have to answer questions. Oftentimes people do talk. We may ask you, why are you being stopped? And there's a reason why we ask, because if you were to say, yeah, I was speeding, well, you actually just admitted to speeding. So there's a reason why they do that. But legally, you don't have to provide information. But an officer's reaction should be, I recognize that you don't want to roll it down, and that should be the end of it.
Okay.
Should be the end of it.
Now, do you think, so, like, for your officers, let's say we're in that spot where it's okay, I don't want to roll my window down past the amount that I can pass. Do your officers then start looking for stuff more stuff like, okay, well now I'm gonna kind of check your car out even more in detail to see if I can, or run a dog, or I mean, because it's a kind of retribution type thing, or is it?
Yeah, they're already doing that. I mean, the dog part is separate. I mean, you got to have separate cause, but they're already looking for for stuff on the floor or any. I mean, they're looking for contraband. And if they see it, well, that allows them access to the car, right?
Probable cause, yeah.
It gives them the reason to go into the car. But at the end of the day, if there's nothing there and you don't roll your window down as far as they're at, they may try to keep talking to you. They're going to try to convince you, hey, roll it down. I'm just going to give you a ticket, or we're going to talk about this. But at some point, the decision has to be made. They either, okay, you've done what you needed to do. I'll go back to my car and I'll write you a warning, or I'm going to give you a verbal warning, and I'm going to move on to the next stop. It shouldn't go any further than that.
Okay.
At some point, it needs to stop.
Yeah.
I mean, I will tell you that most often, and I was a cop on the streets for a long time. I mean, I worked in big city, and if we had suspicious behavior, we would try everything we could within the law to try to have an interaction. But at some point, you have to recognize the fact that, okay, we're done.
Yeah.
I mean, the person, and I think you're in a good example is a question you ask, and I hear it in your videos. Am I being detained? Okay, and you want to ask that.
Yeah.
And for the cop, they need to figure it out very quickly. Do I have legal groundwork right now to say yes?
See, I feel like that's something that's very interesting, because a lot of times, first off, that should be a warning to the cop. Like, okay, this guy's asking me this question. Right. He's got more questions, and his brain is loaded with his rights, right? But secondly, I asked that question because I want to understand too, right? Like, what is it that I've done that you? Because if you say to me, well, we have reasonable suspicion you filmed, then you crawled over the fence, and then you were looking in cars, and then you were trying to check the handles. We think you're trying to steal stuff. That would be reasonable to ID and all these things. I know that's a far-fetched thing, but a lot of times when it's just me filming or something, and I'm walking around City Hall, not here, but in other places, people have said, well, we're detaining you. We need to figure out who you are, and they say that's a lawful order. I think it's very difficult for a lot of people to understand that there's lawful orders, right? Yep. And then there's also unlawful orders, but there's also, you have a right to say, I'm not going to answer your questions. But you can't resist arrest, even if it's unlawful.
Correct.
And I think a lot of people misunderstand an old Supreme Court ruling from, I think, what was it, 1907 or something? Yeah. And there's been many Supreme Court rulings since that say, even if, let's say, you're arresting me, I know it's bogus, I can't resist you. Correct. Even if it's a bad arrest. And so I want people to be cautious of that too. Everybody has to go to court, so go to court. But in terms of that asking the questions in RAS, I mean, do you guys talk about that before
absolutely.
Getting into detentions and stuff like that?
Well, I mean, you talk about, I mean, that is one of the most critical functions that the officer does, especially a young officer. And that's what I emphasize in class, is that you can read a book on the Fourth Amendment, on when I can detain you, when I can ID you, okay? But when you put it into practice, it can be much different than that. And there's you could take a variety of scenarios. And to your point, when you're walking around, it's daylight, you have a video camera on. Okay, that doesn't raise the suspicion level to me that I may come up to you and say, hey, how's it going? Can I help you with something? And see where it goes. But I'm not going to start getting into questions about who you are, should you be here, things like that. That's off limits right now. It may come up at some point, but at the same token, if I'm on routine patrol at 2 a.m. and I've got a business that's closed, and we have a rash of burglaries, and I come around the back side, and now I've got you sitting in the back of the building, standing there with a backpack. Okay, that looks a little differently, and I may have a little bit more legal footing to come up to you and ask you a few more questions. Could you be a cleaner? Absolutely. But I think it's a different place. And I think the hard part is, as a young officer, is these things happen so quickly. And sometimes I think they get caught in a, where you'll ask a question and they just think that here's the answer. And then they feel like they've got to hold their ground. And I think cops could do a better job of just slowing it down and saying, you know what, you're right. You're not detained. I don't have, and I think I've seen this on video where another party comes out, a supervisor or a more senior officer, and their approach is different.
100%.
And I think the reason for that is that that's through experience, but I've seen it where it looks like you have some more seasoned officers that come up to you and maybe detain you or ask more questions. But every cop should be given that fundamental. And those are where things can go terribly wrong, right? I mean, when I say you're detained and I'm stopping you from moving, that's very powerful.
Yeah.
And I think that it, for
because who else can do that? Nobody else can do that.
Right. And so you want to make sure that if you're in any doubt, let it go. If you don't want to roll your window down all the way, and you've already provided what you needed to do, then move on.
Yeah, everything's legal, right?
And I think that comes down to the personality of the officer. I'm not going to tell you every cop is good. Every cop's going to do it the right way. If you hire good people that can realize these situations and adapt and make changes on the move, they're processing it a lot differently than some others who are just fixated on certain things. And you need to be able to identify those people from the very start.
That makes sense. I agree with that.
You hire the wrong person, that person's going to have a career that is going to create more work for you than making sure you hire the right person. Now, we can get into a whole nother topic about recruitment and it's hard to get good people. We're pretty fortunate here. We have a very supportive council. We have a good department. We have good training. We use our psychological examinations. Even if I say I want you and I send you off for an evaluation and I have any red flags, I'm passing. I'm sorry. I'm not going to take the risk. But you got to have the right person, and you encounter all sorts.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. I'm very sure. And now let me ask you, because this is a good kind of follow-on, I should say. I know we talked about that. Let's see here. There was one question in here about. Let's do this one. So, Lucina asks, do you think it would be beneficial for some calls to be handled by certified mental health experts instead of police?
I think we all would agree with that. The problem is that you can't put everything in one bucket. And so oftentimes, there are organizations in Hennepin County that they do go out and handle mental health related calls. But there are calls that are given to them. Oftentimes when we get the call, it's after hours, and there's usually some element of either a crime being committed or maybe a threat, someone who's suicidal, depressed. Those are calls that are going to come into 911, and there's not currently an agency that is able to take those calls and to send appropriate resources.
Sure.
We become we are the first responders to everything from you're upset with your neighbor to a barking dog to a shooting is occurring right now. And so we put on these different hats and have to react differently to each of these situations. And mental health is it's our priority right now. And for us, what we've done is we've had extensive training on responding, identifying those in crisis, and really trying to slow things down. We often use the word de-escalation. We slow things down is what we do. And by doing that, we can assess the scene a little bit more diligently. And if we need resources there that are beyond our scope, like we actually partner with Plymouth Police Department. We have an embedded social worker that works with us and works with Plymouth. And I can give you an example. A while ago, we had a person who physically assaulted another person and then barricaded himself in a home. He wasn't going anywhere. He was armed with a knife. We knew he had some depression. We just locked down the scene. And we get on the phone and talk to our social worker. We get the right people there to make sure everybody's involved in the decision. And so while it would be really nice to have a group that could take those calls from the very start, the reality of it, there is nothing like that. 2 o'clock in the morning, we'll get a call of somebody in crisis. We have to go.
Yeah.
So the most important thing you can do is make sure your officers are trained to recognize mental illness, somebody who's in crisis, and be able to respond accordingly.
That makes sense. That's fair. So I was going to Ranger 77 asked, have you considered more de-escalation training? And obviously the answer to that is yes, as we just talked about. You guys
more training isn't the answer. We do a tremendous amount of training regarding de-escalation, slowing things down, handling things a little bit more diligently, making sure we have the right personnel on hand. When I think of de-escalation, it's a mindset, right? And so when you it's the character of the officer. you will see officers who have the same training and who have a different approach, and oftentimes it's through their character, who they are as a person. Compassion. I mean, if you hire people that are compassionate and have empathy, then that almost translate into they will have that going into the call. It's not something where there's a step-by-step process that if someone does that, I do that, and there's like this very formal way of doing it. It's really, can I problem solve quickly? If I'm dealing with you and you're escalating, de-escalating, I just need to be able to process that and adapt accordingly. If you escalate and the officer responds to that, okay, appropriately, but if you change, the officer needs to recognize that and then come back down, and they just need to be able to move around. And I think that's the character of the officer. Training is obviously important. It's not just more training is not the answer. We are, every department that I work with, we've been teaching de-escalation techniques forever. They've called it several different names. It's really the officer's ability to interact with somebody in a way that's compassionate, shows empathy, procedural justice. There's things that you can do to help calm the scene.
Yeah.
And you can also do things that bring it to the next level.
Yep.
And usually that's because of the officers, maybe their character,
Their mindset.
And so you have to change that. And if you hire the wrong person with the wrong mindset, that's a tough one.
And so that kind of leads me to my next question, or I shouldn't say that, but Paul asked, should the police investigate themselves? If so, do you see how, in the eyes of the public, these policies appear to only protect bad cops? And I think the main point to that, right, for me anyways, is when I see an officer, I would call it ego, right, whose ego won't let them assess the situation and say, he's kind of got a point here, I'm going to let it go. I found a lot that are very good at seeing that and going, maybe we shouldn't. But when you see a cop with ego concerns, we'll call it.
Sure.
What we do is we report it. As an auditor, I report it, right? But the community kind of gets concerned with, okay, so who investigates?
Right.
Where does that go? Does it stay in their file? Does that file follow them? And this is just to give you an example, not to say that it's the case. But let's just say you left LA because of an incident that happened and you came home.
Sure.
Does that follow you? I mean, these are things I think we're all kind of curious about as to how do we know what that officer's character is like. And
I'm going to answer the last part first and then go back because I'm going to forget. So one of the things, and I'm not going to, Los Angeles is a large department. Okay, I applied from Minnesota. I was hired. Everything was done. And at the time, there was no email. Everything was done internally. There was nobody on site. Nobody came out to really talk to my neighbors, find out who am I? Who is Scott? And I was hired, right? And I think I did a pretty good job. I came from the Midwest, and then when I applied for Minnetonka, a Minnetonka sergeant showed up in L.A. and knocked on my neighbors' doors. Went to talk to my supervisors, interviewed my coworkers to find out what kind of person I was. Okay, when you do that type of background investigation, it's easy for me to say in Minnetonka, we have a smaller department. We put a lot of emphasis on hiring. Larger departments, and you can check around to see what they do. Ask them, what do you do? What's your background look like? Are you out knocking on doors? Are you asking neighbors? Tell me about Scott. What have you ever seen him get upset? Go to my former employees. How do I interact with my coworkers? How do I interact, especially if I'm doing customer service? We think a lot of what we do is customer service. The problem is that you can't pick to choose to go to a different city. You can go to Best Buy and not be happy. You can go to another store. You can't pick your police department.
Yep.
Right? And
that's
so
very true, yeah.
Yeah, and so you want to make sure. So when you think about baggage in other departments and all of a sudden they land in your department, that shouldn't happen. You should find that out. And we have passed on people who've had issues in a different city. Okay, we have. Now, the question about, we should not investigate our own. Okay, now, does that happen? And if you think about officer-involved shootings or where there's a death or there's serious injury, we don't investigate those.
The BCA or something.
Right now, the BCA does the investigation. Okay, we don't do that. If I have an allegation of misconduct, maybe someone's rude, if there's things that we think we can handle internally, we'll do that. Okay, and I think we do a good job of it. But the nature of the allegation will depend on who investigates it. I've had attorneys investigate our officers because I felt, ooh, that one's too close. It is mostly, it's really not from outside, but if you have an allegation that you think we shouldn't be doing our own, we hire an attorney to do it.
Do you think that somehow through everything that's going on today, that we can come up with some form of solution where there's kind of criteria that shows what law enforcement agencies should be investigating themselves and what they should be passing to a different thing? Is there, you know what I mean?
I think for us, we classify them in 3 different areas. Sometimes you just call me and say, hey, I didn't like that I got a ticket, I want to complain. We call that a service inquiry. Mm-hmm. It may not be something that they did wrong, it's just that you're not happy that you got a ticket. Okay, mm-hmm. We handle those internally, and we have a process.
Sure, that makes sense.
If you allege I
got a cop speeding.
What's that?
In Burnsville, I caught a cop speeding.
Yep.
So then I filed a complaint.
Okay,
and he didn't want to talk to me about it.
Yeah, and those things they're going to handle internally,
mm-hmm.
and we pay attention to that. We don't want our officers out there. They're enforcing speed limit laws. They need to use their signal. They need to do all those things. We do internally deal with those folks, and I've had some people at driving school, to get them retrained on how to drive properly. That's not uncommon. But an example where your car is towed, and all of a sudden you come back to your car and you're missing something from your car, something mm-hmm. valuable. You call me and say, hey Scott, I had a speaker, or I had $50 in my center console. It's missing. That we turn over to another agency. So that depends on the level of allegation. The ones that I hear more often about are ones that are if it's true, it's pretty serious. Mm-hmm. Those ones get outsourced to whether it's a private attorney we hire, or in a case where there's BCA will handle some of them. The ones where, hey, I'm upset about the officer was speeding, or maybe he swore at me. We do handle those internally.
Okay. Now, I'll give you another example. If I were to file a complaint, and this is not true, but if I were to file a complaint where, maybe I felt I was assaulted by an officer or illegally detained.
Yep.
Who handles those investigations?
We've outsourced our ones. The ones we've had where someone called and said they were illegally detained, we've sent it out for an attorney.
Okay. So you guys don't handle those on your own?
No.
Okay. Do you think, do most of your colleagues and peers that are at that level, do they all kind of feel similarly about that, or does it kind of depend on the department size?
It really depends on the seriousness of the allegation. I mean, you could say that I shouldn't have been stopped. We're gonna look at that, but I've had some that where maybe it was an arrest, or maybe it went a little bit too. The department's gonna have to take an initial look at it. Mm-hmm. And for several reasons, if we were to look at that today, you're going to see more departments that'll outsource that. For the sole purpose of it, it's more transparent. Mm-hmm. Let it get out. But we always will look at an incident to see, okay, is that something that we think that we can handle internally, fairly, and making sure that when people look at what we did, it's not going to be questioned, or should we send it out? And so it's a pendulum that kind of switches back, and depending on the allegation. And so while you could say I shouldn't have been stopped, the officer had no reason to stop, we would look at it. We have in-car camera systems. We would do an initial look, and if all of a sudden I said, I don't like that, I would probably say, time out, we need to get somebody else to look at it.
Okay.
If I look at it and say, wait a minute, because quite honestly, and our in-car camera systems have been phenomenal, if I look at it and say, no, that's not what happened, what I do, I would say, hey, Rowdy, why don't you come in? Let's sit down and let's watch the video. Mm-hmm. And then let's talk about it. And quite often, we come to resolution, because sometimes what your experience was different than what's on video, and I think when we talk about it, it's resolved. And I've had good luck with that. So I don't want to say that everything goes out. It's just a matter of where it falls.
That makes sense.
On the seriousness.
And when you do that, I mean, do you generally? So let's say, maybe I felt it was one way, but the camera angle shows me. When you sit down with people and you kind of explain, okay, here's where we're at, and here's why we're at that. I mean, do you generally come to a resolution with them? Do they feel more comfort seeing it and knowing that you investigated it?
Yeah, and if I have time, I don't know if you guys are in a hurry, but I have a very good example of this. About a year ago, I took a call from a black mother who happened to be following her 16-year-old son who was black, and our officer pulled him over, and she pulled over with her son, because she's not sure what's going to happen, right? Mm-hmm. It happened, and the officer walked up, and it was they had a great conversation. However, her experience with police is quite different.
Yeah.
And what I've learned from just dealing with that is, like, in my mind, I'm thinking we did everything right. The officer was really good, but the perspective of mom and her experience with law enforcement is different. And how do we recognize that difference? And so we actually put together a video. I had the officer, the mother, and the 16-year-old we put them in, and that's something we did last year, and we're hoping to do a little more engagement, just because I think it's important for not only for officers to really know that even if they think they're doing everything by the book, sometimes people have a different reaction.
Yeah.
And unless you sit down and talk about it, it doesn't go anywhere. People still have it. And so this mother and her son did a great job. And then her on her end of it, she thought, I didn't know some of those things. Like, a couple of them were, she stopped like close in traffic, and he was trying to get her to move past. It wasn't because he didn't want her there. It was more because there was a lot of cars coming by. It was at night, and when you ask a question about, what can you do, and so for her, she says, I didn't realize some of those things. Well, for me, my reason for doing it was the officer didn't realize that you are a mother and you are going to stop. I don't care what color you are. In fact, the officer went home after we started talking about how we were going to work with this, because I think it was so important. His mother says, I would have stopped too. And for the cop to think, well, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think when you talk about perspective, we all have different perspective. And when you come down and sit down, I'm not going to point to you and say, what you told me is wrong. I'll say, here's the video. Let's talk through this and see if at the end of the day.
Because I think that's another thing that it's helpful. I don't think all departments do that.
I think they try.
They try to, and I think it also depends on what's going on at the time.
And I think we have no secrets. I have no problem sitting down with you. I'll answer any question you have, and I think that most departments sometimes feel like they want to, kind of close the door and not be as visible. I will tell you that, and since we've had this, this has been a terrible year, obviously.
Yeah.
Our orders to our officers is get out there, talk to people, show them who you are, sit down with people. I go to events. It doesn't matter what it is. Be present. You can't hide.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think when you do that, then it's because we have no secrets.
Yeah, and I think that's what creates trust with the public, right?
Absolutely.
Because if we can sit down and have these conversations,
right?
Number one, you're aware of, like, okay, maybe we could address, like the black mother, right? Saying, well, we should sit down and this is something we should address, and make them comfortable with that interaction. And if there's something we can learn, then you can learn it right there. And like you said, the officer's perspective gets changed by that interaction.
Sure.
And all of a sudden now that officer thinks differently. And that's great, and that's very powerful the next encounter, when he could walk to them and say, hey, I totally get you want to stop. I'm just going to ask you to pull up here, so that way you don't get hit, but you're more than welcome. You know what I mean?
That's exact. Instead of me saying, keep moving, just say, exactly, okay, this is your son. Why don't you park your car, walk up, we can interact, all three of us together.
Yeah.
Just change it. And it doesn't minimize the stop.
Nope.
It's just recognizing that we all have a different experience. And even though if we think we're doing everything perfectly right, others aren't going to have the same reaction. And
that's very true.
And I think that's hard for cops to recognize. That they're doing it by the book. Well, sometimes people's what they've learned through wherever they grew up or their experiences in life, they're so different that there was no book. People didn't go by the book. They treated you unfairly. And so I totally agree with what you just said. I think that's exactly our purpose of the video, and we did it with Plymouth. And our goal, literally, until COVID came, we were actually going to have about 30 officers from different departments sit down with community members and just talk through what they saw. At the end of the day, people might still have a reaction or still have a personal belief, but I think if you don't sit down, at least try, you're missing it. You're missing an opportunity.
Yeah, I would agree. Well, I guess that kind of leads to the next one, right? So how do the cops feel about public recording them, when they're in an investigation in a public place,
right.
As long as somebody's like 6 feet away? And this is asked by Lil Pride. So
we're used to it.
Okay.
If there is a cop out there that is trying to take your recorder, anybody's recorder, they are so far behind. Our cops, assume on every traffic stop, on every public encounter, anywhere they're at, there's cameras watching them. It could be you, it could be a video.
The squad car.
It could be the squad car. We've had them for years. It could be surveillance video. They're being watched. And so it shouldn't be any surprise.
Sure.
And they should not have a problem with it.
Okay. And is there, because this is something I think it's very interesting, and it all depends on the department, right? I was with Jason here. We were in Oklahoma City, and we stayed out of the way, but we were pretty close. I mean, I would say within 10 feet the whole time of their interactions. Now, we didn't obviously try to push things. We try to respect space and boundaries and stay out of the way of anything that could potentially make an officer have to move quickly or react to something. But other departments might say, no, that's too close. You have to be 25 yards away, or you have to be this. Is there any kind of, and I don't know if this year will bring something like that up to conversation, but is there any conversation on what should be an acceptable distance so that the person recording can get audio and video while the officer can maintain their safety?
Well, and are you talking about like a crime scene?
Even a traffic stop, right? Like we do cop watch sometimes, and
you want to walk up and see.
Yeah,
I gotcha. I can't give you a certain distance. If you've got it right in you're up with what I call your personal space. But if you walk up on the shoulder and you're recording, I would hope most officers would just recognize that you're just recording. This is you're going to be recorded. Period. And unless you have some reason not to have you in that area, a crime scene where you have tape or something obvious, but just in general public, I don't know what the appropriate. Right now we have COVID. But 6 feet is 6 feet enough? I don't know. It just depends on what's happening or what they're dealing with. But I don't have a good answer to that. To be honest, I don't know how close. Every officer is going to have a little bit of a different approach.
What would you tell So I'll ask it to you this way: what would you tell your officers if somebody says, hey Chief, I had this guy recording me. He was about 10, 15 feet away, but I wasn't sure if I could ask him to move back a little bit farther. What would your answer to that officer be?
Well, I would say every situation is a little different, but I would say 10 to 15 feet. I feel pretty comfortable. I think cops. Again, this is going to be mindset. Not everybody is going to hurt you. You have to be able to evaluate the situation and make adjustments. But I also think it's important to recognize that people are going to get close to you, maybe make you feel a little uncomfortable, but you still got the framework of the law. You still have to recognize that, me being uncomfortable as a cop, that could happen. And I can't overreact.
It's probably going to happen. I would guarantee it's going to happen.
You will be uncomfortable. Yeah, you are going to be in uncomfortable situations. It doesn't give you being uncomfortable doesn't give you the authority to be aggressive or to do things. You still have, and so it's easy for me to say, for our cops.
Sure.
But I also think that being a cop is, you're going to be in uncomfortable situations. I'm going to walk into a house and it's going to be a little unnerving for a little while, but you have to be able to assess it and not overreact.
Yeah.
And so I can't give you an exact distance. I would just tell the officer that not everybody's there to harm you. You have to really assess the situation and just know your groundwork, where you can work, what you can say or what you can do. Because what if the person decides to push back?
I'm that person.
You have to be really careful. So if you're going to start reacting to that, you better make sure you have complete, you're within policy or within state statute. All these things come into factor, and you got to process it very quickly. And if you have the wrong person that doesn't process things correctly, things go wrong.
Yep.
We've seen it. It happens.
That's true. And it's also okay to, like you said before, slow things down and even call and ask, hey,
exactly.
I got this. What should I do? And
that's actually a good point. I think sometimes as an officer, there's tunnel vision. You are the primary officer and you're engaged and it's not going well, right? And it's continuing.
And that's going to happen.
It's going to happen. Your partners need to come up and step in because oftentimes I see this quite often. If I arrest you on the street and you're belligerent and you're swearing and you don't want to go to jail and we end up in jail, oftentimes the second person that comes in has a better relationship with the person just because you take away that
100%.
Yeah,
100%.
So that's why I think it's important for cops to recognize when your partner's struggling And maybe it's just because they're just so fixated and you guys are going back and forth. Step in and say, hey, Rowdy, we got this. Don't worry about it. Just ignore. And I think you need a disconnect. The officer needs a disconnect. And we teach this with our pursuits. If I'm all of a sudden, I go to stop you and you take off and I'm chasing you all over town for 5-6 miles, I'm doing 100 miles an hour, all of a sudden you stop and my adrenaline's going, I'm focused. Last thing I want the officer to do is to go up and interact with you. Anybody, the officer should be not involved. The other officers, well then, and this is what we teach our cops. The person who puts you in handcuffs should not be the primary officer.
Interesting. Okay.
Just because you're so attached to that scene, it's hard to control. It's adrenaline, and for cops, they need to slow down. And if the officer can just step back and let his or her partner step up and deal with you, they have a chance to slow things down.
That's true. I like that. That makes a lot of sense. Let's see. Let's do one more question. I guess, you know what? I want to ask this question. What is it that you want the public to understand? And I know you can only speak for your department, but I know there's a lot of stuff going around. There's a lot of conversation going around, right? With what do we do with law enforcement in the sense of, is it reform? Is it defund? And there's a lot of different things that are being thrown around that's all over the board, right?
Right.
But I think before you can even talk about those things, we have to have the discussion of what is it that law enforcement officers go through and how can we as the public help law enforcement weed out bad officers.
Right.
So can you kind of walk us through that part?
Well, you want to hire the right cop. You want to recruit. You want to make sure the right people are getting the profession. And so, whether it's starting at high school or trying to, get people involved in wanting to be a police officer. So you're kind of, the problem is there are, we used to have 400 or 500 applicants. We're down to maybe 100 and some. So the applicant pool is smaller, and it's hard to find the right people to hire. But for the public is really, cops are just, they're your neighbor. They have they're just no. And it's hard. It's easy for me to say because I think that oftentimes we have if you're a police officer, maybe you have a different view on how you interact or how you handle things. The cops that I know, they hang out with their families. They go to the same places that you go to, and they do all the same things. So they're pretty average, normal people. All they want to do is come to work and do good work.
Yeah.
Right. And so as the public, as you look at things that we can do to improve our profession, is making sure we have the right people getting in the profession and supporting those individuals who do it. And if you have the people that shouldn't be in the profession, get rid of them.
And how do you do that? Because it's kind of a big...
It's a big conversation, and I know you have unions and there's arbitration. And certain unions are stronger than others. We have a police union here. It mostly focuses on what days they get off, holidays. It has nothing to do with operational procedures. Our contract's maybe 12 pages long. Some larger departments, the unions are more involved in like how they operate the police force.
Almost like an HR type.
Well,
role.
If you want to create like a policy on something, the union's going to step in and look at it from a union perspective on how that affects their members. Okay. I make all operational decisions. I make all policy decisions. We implement them. I make all training decisions. Our union is strictly there to make sure they have good wages, they have the right days off. It has nothing to do with like how cops interact with you and the public. And I think for the viewers out there to recognize each union's a little different and how they're set up. And most of our unions, like in the suburbs, the union is not like I would call a strong union. They're there, but they're not as strong as some of the other larger unions that you hear about. And I think that most viewers take issue with some of the larger unions.
Yeah, because I think there's also an element of like protection.
What their role is. Yeah, and I know from my experience with our union, if we had a bad officer, my union, the officers union or sergeants union, would be right there to help me get rid of that person.
Okay.
Because I will tell you this, they go out every day and do hard work. We have a community engagement officer, And when something happens that affects us, we take a step backwards, and they become so frustrated. And when you see what happens around us in the country, and we've done so much hard work, and something happens where it just takes away from all of us. I don't care what department you are. You could be in northern Minnesota, you could be in Minneapolis, St. Paul, or you could be Minnetonka. We all have the same reaction that whatever just happened just pushes us back 10 years. And so the cops are doing some, and I'm not going to say every agency. I'm going to speak on behalf of Minnetonka. Our cops would want to weed out that bad cop.
Okay.
And they would support that. And we've done that in the past.
What are your thoughts on qualified immunity? Because I know that's a lot of people are talking about that. And what are your thoughts on that? How does that play a role with
I would just encourage the viewers to do a little bit more research on what it actually does. And so, for instance, if you're within policy, if you're operating under the federal law, constitutional law, state law, there is protection. And the reason they do that is because when officers make split-second decisions, and they are within these laws and policies, there's somebody there to step in to help to make sure that they just don't get left out there on their own. Okay, but what oftentimes I hear is that it protects officers. It protects them, or it offers somebody to step in and defend them, or gives them the immunity if they're within policy, if they're within law. If you step out of policy, or if you're charged and you're convicted, you have no immunity.
So, let me ask you it this way, because I think this is interesting.
Yeah.
Let's say, I'm within my right. I'm recording, right? I'm not breaking any laws, and a cop says, "I'm going to arrest you because you won't give me your ID." Does that cop most of the time? I know it's not a black and white thing, right? But it's like, does most of the time that cop lose qualified immunity if indeed I wasn't breaking any laws and I notified him of that or her of that? I mean, how does that get determined? You know what I mean? In any scenario, I guess.
It's usually on the front end. The cities will make a determination if they're going to back the officer.
Okay. And
it goes to court. Ultimately, I think the judge makes the decision on does the person have qualified immunity.
Okay.
It's done early on in the court proceeding. And that every situation is a little different. But I would say a very easy answer for me on that is if we have a no chase policy, no pursuit policy, and the officer decides to chase, and they're outside of policy, they violate policy, and let's say the offender crashes into a third party, or let's say they crash on their own and they get seriously hurt or killed, right? Because that officer was operating outside of policy, they can lose their qualified immunity. Okay. So you can lose it. And I think Minneapolis will be an example of that. Is if they find the officers are outside their scope of if they're violating federal law, state law, or policy, the city they don't always get qualified immunity. So I think there's a little bit of a distinction on what it actually does.
Before we can have any more conversation on what to do.
Yeah, you can lose it. I would say not having any protection has some dangerous, pretty ripple effects on enforcement. I'll be honest with you. I would have a hard time being a police officer on the street, just because depending on how is it an allegation? I mean, because it happens, right? But are you going to be personally liable for every mistake? Now, some of these mistakes come with some pretty dramatic
I think that's kind of the concern, right?
And I would agree with that.
How do you? I think that's kind of a conversation. Unfortunately, most, especially the media, does not do this, right? We just don't just sit down and have an honest conversation, express concerns, and then get answers from somebody of your stature, right? But in some way, shape, or form, there's got to be some way to kind of set a standard. And I think this is the thing that's very interesting to me. Yeah. There is no standardized, post training. There's no standardized academy training across the country, or explanation of qualified immunity, union regulations. Besides federal law, there is, or in state law, which again could be very different from state to state. There is no kind of standardized understanding. So, yours and my conversation, it may be completely different in LA, right, where you were there before. Right. Now I know LA puts a lot of money into investigating and checking things out, but there might be departments out in that area that don't, or maybe south of us, or whatever. But having those discussions and standardizing those things so that people understand, okay, well, this is where a cop gets qualified immunity, and this is where they don't. Because that would give reassurance.
Right. No, I agree with that. And I think at the end of the day, the court, usually they're done at the beginning of court proceedings. The judge will determine, okay, the officer has qualified immunity, and they're operating within policy. But they're also ones that can continue to go forward and they can lose it. I mean, I think that just not having it, if you want to change and make cops more held liable, it starts with the agency. And it starts at the top of the agency, and they just need to recognize behavior that's problematic and take action. And if officers have 12, 15, 20 complaints in their folder, okay, does that cause alarm?
They tell you something, yeah. They're all the same kind of stuff.
Right. I think that when you look at agencies, they need to clean. They need to make sure their house is in good working order. And if you do that, then if things were to happen, then people are held accountable. I mean, if there's a violation and they're held accountable, but I think we get caught up in what it is and what it's not. And I would agree with you. There needs to be more discussion. I think there's this reaction. Let's just get rid of it. Well, that has consequences.
Correct. Yeah.
And so I just think you need to work through those things. Now, is there some middle ground? Yeah, but also know that if there's a violation, they don't get they can be that qualified immunity be taken away, and they're on their own.
Yeah.
They have to have.
I'm guessing you agree with that, right? If somebody's breaking the rules and the law.
Absolutely. If you're outside of policy, federal law, if I just come up to you just as an officer with my uniform and use my power as an officer to hurt you, and you're not resisting, I mean, there's things that you got to look at. I mean, there's things that you violate someone's rights. You got to look at that, and if you violate it, then you don't have the backing of the immunity. You have to hire your own defense, and whatever happens, and it's not as clear cut as that. And I think that's part of your solution.
Yeah.
But I think people just don't realize that if they're outside their scope, they don't have it.
Do you think so? A lot of people say a good officer arrests a bad officer. Does it often happen like that? Because I hear that statement a lot.
Oh, cops arrest cops more often than you think.
Really?
Oh yeah. Okay. I mean, if you were to go back, you go back 15, 20, 25 years and you stop a cop that's been drinking, would the cop get a ride? Yeah, they could. Call a cab. I could stop you, and sometimes I would call your family member or do the same thing. Most cops today are going to be more upset that you put me in a position that I have to deal with you. And if you're an officer, to put another cop in a position where they have to deal with you is not right. And so
do they get retribution for that sometimes?
I don't think so. I mean, I would say back in the day, yeah, you might hear about it. Why are you arresting another cop? But you will not find that happening
nowadays
in this day. No. Okay. For one,
that's always interesting.
If we get word that one of our officers let you off on something that they shouldn't have, that's a problem. We'll have a problem with that.
So you're saying, even like as the chief, you're saying if you hear that an officer let another officer off, that's we
will have a problem with that. Okay. Now, if I let you off of the speed, if I would give Rowdy a warning for speed, would I give a cop? I could. Okay. If I get called and I'm dealing with you and maybe you assaulted somebody, and I'm going to arrest you, but I get called to the same scene, a different scenario, but the cop let another cop off for doing the same behavior, where typically that's actually required, then I would say we have a problem.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's fair to say that if I give you a warning or anybody else, I'm okay. But there's certain things that are not okay, and you would be arrested for. And I think anybody, even a cop, should be, they're going to be held accountable. And most cops nowadays are going to say, don't put me in a position to do that.
Do you think that cops should be held to a higher standard because they're law enforcement?
They are.
Okay. But I'm just asking, do you think, for example, let's say there's a scenario where you maybe don't arrest Rowdy, but you maybe say, we got to arrest this officer because it's an officer, we got to do all the things by the book.
DWI is a good example. I mean, one of our, traffic enforcement is way high, right? In DWI, we know what it does. We know what drunk drivers, we know that. Drunk driving, if you're a cop, I would hold you to a higher standard than the other person who's not. Okay. I mean, that's just the way it is.
Cool. Yeah. Well, this has been great. I know we've taken a lot of your time. I really appreciate you sitting down and doing this interview with us. At some point, obviously, I'll talk to you after we end this, but I'd like to, at some point, maybe do a follow-up or maybe a ride-along or something like that down the road. But we can talk about that later. But I appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me and with the viewers to just kind of explain some things that I think a lot of law enforcement don't want to talk about, because these aren't necessarily the easiest conversations to have, but I think they're very needed.
Yep.
And so your willingness to be transparent and to have those conversations is leaps and bounds ahead of where some departments are. I'm not naming anyone, I'm not saying anyone's bad, but that's just a reality of it. And so I appreciate that, and I think your community will appreciate that. I know I have a lot of Minnesotans that watch, and they will appreciate that. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you. I like the opportunity.